Welcome back, all you fine ladies and gentlemen who tune in regularly to listen to me talk to your face. We have let's call it an interesting episode because it's not really a famous story in American history, but it's a great story, and it does have a large effect on the way the commercial airlines industry has played out today. Now, this is the story of an averted disaster, and I think it's interesting that most most disasters and most of these famous stories, they're the ones that you read about and they're the ones that you remember off the top of your head. And the stories where people are real heroes, not to say that the other ones aren't, obviously they are, but they perform heroic actions and save everyone involved, essentially ending in a non-incident. Those stories kind of go by the wayside. I think it's just an interesting thing about humanity. I guess we love a story, and sometimes we just are more focused on the disaster type of heroics rather than the avoided disaster of heroics. So this story is really a miracle because it involves total engine failure at 19,000 feet, I believe, for 162 passengers and crew. And to be fair, the reason that I'm telling this story is also fairly self-serving. If you've been listening to all the episodes so far, you might remember back in episode 9 or 10 where I began the episode with a tribute to my grandfather. And the reason I know this story, and there's a lot of people out there who do, but the reason I'm so familiar with it is because my grandfather was the captain of this flight and the ranking officer. So I'm telling this story from just the overall perspective, but I have the unique account of the ranking officer, captain in charge, and I have grown up with him telling me this story, and I think it's one that you guys will like and be very interested in. So, without further ado, let's jump into Eastern Airlines Flight 855 in what I am calling the Miracle over Miami.
You're listening to The Monday American, the show that puts the story back into history.
History is all about discovering the why, and I think that in that process, it's important to never take the story out of history.
Making history come alive, one episode at a time. The show made for the people, by the people. Dive into The Monday American. Don't worry, we'll be gentle.
So, like all stories go, this one is going to need a little bit of context in order to bring forward the weight of the story. So let's start with the crew. Steve Curtis Thompson. This is my grandfather. I actually, just a quick side note, had the unbelievable, it's a blessing in my life that grew up with a single mother and two sisters and myself. And when I was in fourth grade, we moved into a house that my grandpa and my grandmother lived in. Just for sake of confusion, I call them Mom, and Pop. But we moved in there with the idea to just move out, 6 months later or so. But we discovered that it was a bit expensive. I say we, but I was in fourth grade, not like I was sitting down and crunching numbers, but it was a bit expensive. So we ended up actually living with them in the same house for a little over 16 years through my time in college. And that's an experience I would not change I wouldn't trade that in for anything in the world. And Pop, Captain Thompson, if you will, he became like my father. He would pick me up from football. He put me up on the roof to blow off the roof when I was way too young to be up there, freaking my mom out. One day he was cutting down a tree in the front yard. The question of why was never something that needed to be answered. It was just because was always the answer. So you never really questioned him. And he came upstairs one day and asked me to come out and help him because he had started cutting this tree down, and he was cutting it down the wrong way. It was going to fall in the house. I must have been 15 at the time. So he had me throw a rope, and this was a pretty big tree, about 150, 200 feet tall, fairly girthy, if you will. And he had me throw this rope around this tree and pull it away from the house and on top of myself. And I'll never forget, this is one of my favorite stories about him. He looked at me and he said, "Now, when that tree starts falling, you run like hell." And I just thought this was the coolest thing I'd ever done. So I started pulling on the tree, and it, sure enough, it started falling away from the house. And right as it pretty much was to the point where it was going to fall on its own without any more effort of pulling it, my mom just happened to open the front door and just ask, "Hey, what are you guys doing?" And it was right then when he started yelling, "Run, run, 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 run!" And I'm running out of the way of this tree falling. And I'm sure we took many, many years off of her life with her heart health, just from that one instance, and plenty more. But just to give you guys the idea of like this is my dad pretty much, and it makes me really happy to be able to tell this story and to look back and to be able to say truly he was a hero. So he was born in Clyde, North Carolina. If you've never heard of it, that's probably you're in the majority of that. It's very near a town called Bat Cave, North Carolina, which doesn't help put it on a map at all. It's very close to Asheville. It's up in the mountains. If you've ever seen Cold Mountain, that was the setting of that movie was very close to where he grew up. He was born on March 18th, 1935, and was the oldest of 6 children. Now, early on in his life, and this is, I think, a pivotal part of what helped him manage this situation years to come, he took on the role of patriarch to his family. His parents had an untimely early death, and that was one of the things that was very, very well known about him, was his passion and love for his family, a family that continues to grow even after he passes. And like I just said, he took us in, they took us in, and we were just the last of his growing family to actually live with him. He had exchange students for his whole life. And just, we have a very, very large family. We're very close, and that's something that he cultivated and oversaw, because that was incredibly important to him. And through all of this, he learned an invaluable set of skills throughout that time of leading his family as a young boy. I believe he was about 16. Skills like leadership, responsibility for others, that ultimately prepared him for his most difficult flight many years later. It's the skill set of a parent, and I obviously am not a parent. I don't know why I say obviously, you're not here with me, but I'm not a parent, so I don't know how much weight I can throw into this argument, but it's the skill set of a parent that trains you to think critically in difficult situations. That, in my opinion, it helped save the lives of all 162 passengers and 10 crewmen on board that aircraft many years later. Because of his early role as a leader of the household, he learned how to instinctively make decisions in order to ensure the well-being of others. It's an intangible skill, especially as a pilot. And he began flying when he was 19 years old, quickly discovered his insatiable passion for flight and aviation. And I truly cannot begin to count the number of times I just saw his whole face just light up throughout the many, many years of living with him, when anything regarding airplanes, flight, or anything aviation was a topic of discussion. He would always be a lively conversationalist. He had a gift of making people laugh, but when flight or aviation was the topic, he went into just an entire new level of passion, and you could just see how much he loved flying just being broadcast on his face. He was truly a captain of aviation, and a man that was born to be in the cockpit. Now, that's who the captain was on this flight. And that intro, by comparison to the other two of the cockpit members, is going to make it seem like I'm heavily biased. Obviously, I should be. I just don't have a ton of information on the other men. I do know that they stayed friends throughout their lives, and often that's the case when you survive an incident like this. You become very close, kind of like the Brothers of War analogy that I'm sure you've heard many of times. The other crew members consisted of Captain Dick Bodie and flight engineer Dudley Barnes. You have to remember that this flight, when this happened, was in 1983, And that is back in the day where they had two pilots and a flight engineer. And the pilots were basically controlling the aircraft and flying, while the flight engineer was making sure all the systems of the flight were good to go. He would, check things like oil levels, which is a crucial part of this story, things like that. And it's since been replaced with computers. Not to say that that job was not absolutely vital, because it was. It's just one of those roles that a computer can pick up and do rather than a person, and we don't need to dive into that whole argument. So my grandfather, Captain Thompson, he was serving as the supervisory check airman. For those of you unfamiliar with aviation, basically he was the ranking officer on this flight, and he was in a role where he was observing Captain Bodie's performance in the aircraft, which was a Lockheed L-1011 aircraft. It's a 3-engine aircraft, and the reason he was supervising this captain's performance, who actually was 10 years older than him, but he outranked Captain Bodie in terms of hours and experience, was to complete his certification on that aircraft. And like I was saying, for those of you unfamiliar with aircraft and how commercial aviation worked, especially back in this days, you had to have a certain number of hours logged in a flight in a type of aircraft to be a certified captain of that aircraft. So although Captain Bodie might have been certified on a number of other 3-engine aircraft, if he hadn't gotten at least 25 hours in the L-1011, he was not a certified captain of that aircraft. All 3 of the men in this cockpit had extensive and impressive flying experience. Pop, Captain Thompson, he had over 17,000 hours of flight logged, with over 300 in that L-1011. Dudley Barnes, who was the flight engineer, had a total of 9,000 hours of logged flight, with 2,666 hours in the L-1011. Captain Bodie had 12,000 hours of flight experience, but he only had 13 hours in this specific aircraft. Now, that number initially would raise some eyebrows of some of the more conspiracy-type minded people, but keep in mind he had 12,000 hours of flying experience. It was just not a lot in this newer type of aircraft. There was absolutely no reason whatsoever that he would be unqualified to pilot that vessel. So the reason that Captain Thompson was the check airman was because he was certifying Captain Bodie as a captain of that aircraft. You're required to have at least 25 hours. Needless to say, between the 3 of the men, experience in the air was not left wanting. Combined, they had accrued more than 38 hours of logged flight, which is that's a staggering amount of time if you think about just an hour. I mean, that's a lot of flight. That's just a lot of flight. So the 3 men in the cockpit, as well as the rest of the crew, but especially these 3 men, played a very, very big role in making sure that this airplane got back to the ground safely. And speaking of the airplane that day, it was a Lockheed L-1011, and that is a 3-engine plane. They're all Rolls-Royce engines that served for quite a long time, I think, and was almost entirely incident-free with its life in commercial aviation. Obviously, because of the story, there's a few incidents, but for the most part, it was a fairly uneventful and non-problematic plane during its service. The flight itself was about as routine as you could get for a commercial passenger jet flight of that day. The date was May 5th, 1983. Like I said earlier, the aircraft type was a Lockheed L-1011 commercial wide-body aircraft powered by 3 Rolls-Royce jet engines. Tail registration was N334EA. It was based on its serial number, produced in 1976, owned and operated by Eastern Airlines, and the flight number was 855, Eastern Airlines 855. It was scheduled to go from Miami International, from Florida, to Nassau International in the Bahamas, which is not a long flight by either way you could measure it, whether you're looking at total mileage or flight time. Nassau was only 184 miles from Miami, in a straight line, that is, and the expected flight time was only 35 minutes. And what I like to remember specifically when going, well, I say remember, what I like to try to make myself aware of, specifically about aviation emergencies, among all other types of these high pressure situations, is the time factor on these pilots. When you consider some of the great disaster stories or avoided disaster stories of American history, it's always incredible to me to look at the timeline of events and notice how quickly things were happening, or how little time that the people involved had in order to make a decision that ultimately saved lives or cost lives. This flight in particular was absolutely no different. With just a scheduled flight time of 35 minutes, that doesn't leave a ton of room to think through and react to situations. The crew of the TriStar L-1011 of Eastern Airlines, assigned for 855, like I mentioned earlier, was comprised of 3 people in the cockpit with a ton of hours. Basically, the initial setup of what these pilots would do is the 2 pilots would be in the cockpit while the flight engineer would do a walk around of the airplane, ensuring everything was visually okay. And before I continue too much farther along this story, what I'm going to do is I'm going to break into using the actual account and the narrative story written by Captain Thompson, his account of the event. So bear with me because I will be reading most of it, but it's the way to present this story with the most meaningful impact, and it's going to keep it entertaining instead of me talking about this event like I was there, which I obviously wasn't, but it's the way that things played out, and you can dive into the mind of the person sitting in the right seat of that cockpit, and in the one that eventually went from a supervisor who was checking on someone's progress to taking the reins and making the decisions that ultimately all 3 of them would make together. But they saved the lives of all these people, and it's a way to just kind of dive into the mind of what was going on in that cockpit. So the pilots are in the cockpit, and they are finishing up, in the captain in the left-hand seat, which would be Captain Barnes, I believe, Captain Dick, turned towards his engineer and asked, "All okay, Dud?" Remember, his name was Dudley Barnes. And the answer is just a straight and sure, "Yes, sir." Captain Dick arranged his Jeppesen charts and threw a glance outside. And this morning in May, at that time of the day, the weather was dry, sunny, the seas were fairly calm, and the sky was just a very pretty bright blue. There were a few low clouds on the horizon. It was a very familiar picture for the region at this season. As soon as they would return from this short flight, the whole crew would continue with a more distant leg of travel, next destination being Los Angeles. The ground engineer responsible for the departure threw a last glance in the aircraft's logbook, signing the pre-flight inspection, and gave the logbook to the captain for aircraft delivery. He signed it as well, and he cut the last carbonized copy and gave it to the engineer. He got it, and with very slow movements, folded it, put it in his shirt chest pocket, and then saluted the flight crew and exited the cockpit. The passengers' boarding were almost completed, and it was about 8:30 in the morning when he stepped out of the main entrance door of the aircraft. The senior cabin flight attendant was standing at the flight deck door and asked the captain if everything was okay, if she could close the doors. He turns his head towards her and politely smiles and nodded, says, "Go ahead and close the doors." Her name was Shirley Alexu, the senior cabin attendant. She was employed for 14 years with Eastern Airlines, and apart from the cabins of the L-1011s, she also flew DC-9s, Boeing 727s, and A300s. She turned towards the air hostess, who was standing near the front door, and asked her to close it. In this short flight, they didn't really have much to worry about as far as attending to the 162 passengers aboard. The engines started up, and the aircraft started rolling, and just 4 minutes before 9 o'clock in the morning, the large plane lifted off from runway 27 left, 27L of Miami Airport. According to the flight plan, they got clearance for level 230, which is kind of avionic for 23,000 feet, with the initial heading southern and moving eastern afterwards, directly towards Nassau. The aircraft climbed for about 8 minutes until it was leveled off at 23,000 feet, and it continued its southeastern track until DME, which is distance measuring equipment, indicated that they were 85 miles from the destination airport. At that point, they got clearance to descend to 9,000 feet. So far, there's nothing out of the ordinary whatsoever. The weather around the destination airport was deteriorating pretty quickly, with broken clouds at 500 feet, overcast at 900 feet, and a moderate rain shower right over the airport, which was seen both visually and painted red on their radar screen. At this point, they had been turned over to the Nassau air traffic controllers for their approach, and really had no radar coverage for a brief moment. They were told that they were the number 2 aircraft in line for landing, following a light airplane in front of them, which is a fairly important part of this story. When I say a light airplane, I mean like a single-engine, propeller-powered Cessna, what you would see at a small airport that a private person who just enjoys flying leisurely would own. The radar screen was still painting heavy fronts ahead of them, and they were cleared for a VOR approach to the runway 23. It was just 15 minutes past 9, and they were descending through 15,000 feet. The distance from Nassau was 54 miles, and they were just concentrating on the initial approach procedures. And I'll take a brief second to explain a VOR approach. And if you're a pilot and listening to this, and I butcher this, I do apologize, because I am not an avionic or an aviator person at all, so I'm doing my best in layman's terms. But a VOR approach, it stands for a VHF omnidirectional radio. It's basically a radio beacon signal transmission that enables the aircraft crew to determine the position in the area of a range of about 200 miles. It's an approach it's called a non-precision approach, which means it's an instrument approach, landing using lateral guidance. It keeps you in line with the runway, but it does not give you vertical guidance. You're up to decide that on your own. It's essentially landing without being able to see where the runway is, laterally due to clouds or fog or something like that. But based on technology, where you need to be as far as altitude. So a VRO approach is used when you can't see the runway until you're right about to land on it. Their approach would be delayed. I'm sorry, I just jumped ahead of myself. The distance, like I said, was 54 miles. They were nearly there. In the right-hand seat, Captain Thompson was taking care of communications, maintaining contact with the towers, doing this VOR approach, when suddenly, on the front center control panel, a red light turned on indicating low oil pressure, warning the crew that the pressure of the number 2 engine oil was low, very much below the allowed limits of its operating level. This was something that all 3 men had experienced multiple times over in a simulator. However, this time was neither for the captain nor for anybody else in the flight deck a defect in a simulator. It was a real problem, and a very serious problem at that. Because Captain Dick was still being supervised, he was still making the calls here, and he gave the instructions for the engine low oil pressure checklist to be executed, which contained the procedures required to shut down the engine. This is a crucial part of the story. The fact that it was the number 2 engine, which is the engine kind of molded into the tail of that airplane of the 3. The other 2 are below the wing, and that he decided to shut down the engine. The flight engineer pulled back the thrust lever to the idle position and placed the start switch of the number 2 engine to the shutdown position. The tapes of the center column and all 3 engine gauges moved towards 0, while the plane decelerated and kneeled slightly. The number 2 engine was gone, and now they were flying with 2 engines, but the thrust produced by the other 2 engines was evenly distributed, like I said, because they were both installed under the wings. The captain pushed the throttle levers of engines 1 and 3 slightly forward in order to maintain the airspeed and compensate for losing one of the 3 engines. Now, at this point, the situation wasn't extremely difficult, but still they were facing an emergency that presented a dilemma. Do they return to Miami, a distance of about 100 miles, or do they attempt to land in Nassau, a distance of only about 50 miles? And above Nassau, the weather was getting kind of tight above and around the airport. Additionally, they had to take into consideration that their approach would be delayed if they don't declare an emergency, as in like calling for a mayday, which no pilot wants to do unnecessarily, because in front of them was a slow-flying single engine prop plane. So they can't jump the pattern without declaring an emergency. That would cause a disaster. Worst case scenario, both planes would crash. A lot of people would die, but you don't want to cry wolf. You don't want to be that pilot. So the three men were discussing the situation and considered their options. It seemed to them ideal to go to the shortest distance to Nassau, but on the other hand, would it be wise to enter those weather patterns down one engine? It could be riskier than flying a longer distance with a third of your power lost. These are real questions and real decisions that needed to be made quickly. And this time, if they didn't act correctly, it wouldn't result in just resetting a simulator and trying again. They wouldn't get to step out of that aircraft. After they weighed their options at hand, they agreed to return to Miami, not the least of reasons being that they could have a lot better technical support there than in an outstation such as Nassau. At this point, they were just assuming one engine was bad. Furthermore, at the moment when they could reach the final approach, the weather in Nassau, quote, would have closed, according to an NTSB report of the incident, beyond the limits provided that the status remained the same with the 2 of 3 engines operable. They started the APU, which is the automatic power. Oh my goodness, I'm blanking on what it is. It's the power. It's like the alternator in the car, which is not a very good comparison at all. Apologize, but it was in accordance with procedures, and the instructor captain Thompson called the Tower of Miami Control, and he said, quote, Miami Center Eastern 855. They replied with, Eastern 855, go ahead. You're off radar contact. Just continue on the heading. We'll have you back in radar shortly. Did you want any higher altitude? This was part of the plan that the captains together had already decided. Captain Thompson answered, affirmative. We'd like to go up, say 190 to 210,000 feet, 19,000 to 21,000 feet. It's an attainable request, given the traffic nearby has permitted the change of level. And the air traffic controller responded with, okay, Eastern 855, what are you in a left turn now? Okay, I have you back in radar here, leaving 13.6. Proceed on 270, heading by radar vector towards Biscayne. The captain raised his right hand and selected the 270 heading in the window of the automatic pilot's panel at the center of the instrument panel, while Captain Thompson confirmed, Roger, heading 270 to Biscayne. The captain pushed forward. Furthermore, the 2 throttles of the engines left to start their climb again. The engines responded by roaring. The aircraft raised its nose to reach the altitude that had been selected. Now, at this point, the controller from Miami Center, he wasn't really happy of that request. That said, it was a reaction that would have been shared by nearly any air traffic controller, the keyword being control as a critical adjective in the job title. They were descending to Nassau. Now they're asking for higher altitude and to change course to the opposite course. And at this point, they haven't informed him that they have a problem on board, but any air traffic controller could have easily spotted all the symptoms lining up, and he radioed in. Eastern 855, any problem we should know about? After a few seconds of hesitation, he received the answer that confirmed his fears. Yes, we've had precautionary shutdown the number 2 engine. The controller insisted further. Eastern 855, you need any special handling? And the crew of the flight deck of that L-1011, believing that they would make it okay, responded with a simple negative. Their beliefs would not remain optimistic for long. 8 minutes had elapsed from the moment where they had gotten the first warning sign of low oil pressure on the number 2 engine when the same warning for number 3 came, and just a few seconds after that, the same one from the number 1 engine. All pilots looked at each other, and this was something that they all had the same internal thought. Strange, all 3 engines couldn't possibly have the same problem, could they? I mean, the odds of that they were very, very slim. So the flight engineer looked over at his instrument panel to the oil quantity indicators, and he could barely believe his eyes. The needles of all 3 indicators were pointing at 0. The oil tank of all 3 engines looked like they were empty, but they were still turning normally. Given the engines still operating at normal by all other accounts, they assume it's an indication problem, hoping it's not possible that the low oil pressure indicators for all three are faulty. They just don't want to accept that they don't take it seriously. They're suspecting it's an electrical problem that gave them these kind of strange indications. And that's got to be the normal human response. Is it couldn't possibly be the worst nightmare, even though in the back of your head it probably is. I think that's probably just a basic human reaction to things, is just, this can't be happening. And even though you know what's happening, you just don't want to believe it. So these men were looking at all of these warning lights, and they just kind of began going into the training mode that they've been prepared for. The flight engineer is scanning the circuit breakers, discovering everything's in the normal position. He pulls out the breakers and presses it again for recycling, and nothing changes. So the crew began calling Miami Center again. Quote, Miami Center, Eastern 855, we have some rather serious indications. We have all indications of all three oil pressure on all engines down to zero. We believe it to be faulty indications. The chances of all three engines having zero oil pressure and zero quantity is almost nil. However, that is our indication in the cockpit at the present time. Control from Miami Center takes action to help about the only way they can and say, quote, okay, fine, why don't you turn right about 15 degrees? We'll give you direct to Miami, maintain flight level 200, which is 20,000 feet altitude. Whatever altitude you want to maintain, you are just going to have emergency equipment standing by anyway for you. Circumstances in the flight deck are not extreme for the moment, since two engines are running, but none of the crew is aware of the nightmare that was about to unfold. This is a point of the story my grandpa always told me in the same exact way, and I think it was ultimately because it ended up saving the lives of everyone on board that day. He told me that the best pilots in the world will always assume that their gauges are true no matter what they're telling you, and you just have to fly based on the parameters of what the plane tells you is going on. This is something that held true to that day, because the decision to turn around to Miami was based on the notion that they were down one engine and within these certain set of parameters. When they began the turn, the other two gauges were showing no oil, and they continued towards Miami and climbed to an altitude, assuming that the gauges were true, but also they were using their gut feelings trying to figure out what in the world was going on. Had the crew not turned to Miami, they wouldn't have made it to land. That was something that every single simulator run after the incident showed. They all ended up in the water. As the crew in the cockpit are trying to figure out just what in the world is going on in front of their eyes, hoping that these gauges that are faulty, rather than anything else, they suddenly receive confirmation of their very worst fears. They were wrong, and the gauges were right. With a very, very loud bang and an ominous howl right afterwards, the right-hand engine announced to the crew their worst fears. The engine burst into flames and smoke and stopped functioning altogether. Pop-Up announced to, this is Captain Thompson, Pop-Up, my grandpa, announced to Miami Center that they had lost another engine. Quote, Miami Center, Eastern 855, now we have also lost the 2 engine. And the tower, they're a bit confused because they thought it was just a mandatory shutdown for the first one. So they reply, okay, you lost the number 2 engine, but you have the other 2 engines turning. Captain Thompson painted the bleak picture for the tower with just a negative tone. Quote, negative, we only have 1 now, and we're going to restart our number 2 engine. So remember, they shut down the first engine. They're running on 1, and they're kind of realizing now that the gauges were right. They're going to lose that engine. In order to attempt to restart the engine that they had already shut down, they follow a very specific checklist, which is for restarting an engine mid-flight. The crucial portion of this story is that if they were successful in doing this, they would have never made it back to Miami, and you'll find out why in a minute. But I want to note that this point in the flight, had they started the engine the way they do when they are on the ground before takeoff, the engine would have restarted. But because they're following this checklist, they were unsuccessful in restarting that engine, and very luckily so. The reason being is that this list runs, they follow it. It runs them through all these basic parameters to restart the engine. One of those is the engine isolation valve, which states as needed. Since the valve was closed, they didn't open it, and that's a point that my grandpa always reiterates later on in his memoir that saved their lives entirely. So let's go back to the nightmare in the cockpit that's unfolding. The 3 men are flying with 1 engine operating out of the 3 total. Of the other two engines, one was shut down and not restarting, and the other one was destroyed completely and issuing a trail of smoke, kind of as if it was marking the path taken towards its imminent watery grave. So at this point, the crew realized that the one remaining engine was not going to last for long, and Miami Center had already sprung into emergency action on their end. Everyone involved in this situation knew what was going to happen. This plane was going in the water, and all they could do was attempt to plan for a water rescue in the very improbable case that anyone survives that touchdown. And really, a water landing, it shouldn't even be called a landing. It's a controlled crash. Until maybe a year or two ago, I think, no one had ever done it successfully in a commercial plane until Captain Solly Sullenberger. He touched down in the Hudson River, and the odds of surviving a forced water landing, they're almost zero. Back in 1983, these three men in the cockpit know that if they do that, they'd be the first to do it and pull it off. So back in Miami, they're in full panic mode. The priority is for the plane to reach the ground safely. They send away all inbound flights. They deny clearance for any departing aircraft to take off and place emergency systems at the airport in alert. Quote, "Okay, fine, we're listening. Okay, cleared direct. Miami's altimeter barometer set to 2989, and you can descend at your discretion at any altitude you want. You are clear of traffic." They respond, "Well, heading direct to Miami, baro set 2989. We'd like a heading to go from runway 27 left, Eastern 855. The squawk of the flight appears in the radar screen approaching the airport, and they reply, "Okay, your position right now is about 70 miles southeast of Miami. With that speed, you are 14 minutes out, heading 285 for Miami." They are left with the only remaining engine and the realization that would fail soon. They call the flight attendants to the flight deck and inform them that they should prepare the passengers and cabin crew for ditching. Now, Captain Thompson always remembered the look on the faces of the other two pilots and the three flight attendants who came to the cockpit. The color of their skin was stark white as a result of the adrenaline pumped into their bloodstream. And he knew if he were in front of a mirror, he would look and see his own face look no different. At 9:33, they lost the one and only operating engine that they had left. From an altitude of 13,000 feet and only the APU operating, they had zero chance of reaching land without restarting an engine. Now the situation was extremely difficult. They radioed in, "Miami Center, we are losing another engine. We have lost our third engine right now." Back at Miami Center, the ground crew have realized that on board 855, the things were going from bad to worse. They were hoping for a miracle, but all they could do was listen in and listen to a nightmare. In the cockpit, now at 13,000 feet, without engine power, no thrust exists anymore, and their speed is maintained only by dropping their nose and descending repeatedly. This monstrous airplane has turned into a powerless glider. Each second brings the pale blue water beneath them closer within their reach. Miami radios in, "Well, 855, have you got the other one started?" Captain Thompson's voice is sharp. Without many comments, he just replies, "Not yet." Controller from Miami Center is audibly anxious. "Do you have any of them turning?" he asks. The answer from the captain once again is a cold and short negative. Everyone involved is keenly aware of the results, so should the situation on board not change, a water landing seems just impossible to avoid. They notify the crew that, quote, "Eastern 855, the Coast Guard is coming towards you now." The airport in Miami is placed in full alarm, the emergency plan reaching its red alert stage, in which planners hoped that they would never ever need. Coast Guard vessels began bounding towards Flight 855 to help in the seemingly unavoidable case of ditching. A Coast Guard Falcon aircraft also took off in order to meet the L-1011 to fly alongside as an escort. Although powerless to provide any help beyond a guide and a set of eyes to identify an issue on the plane's surface that couldn't already be seen. He called in the flight crew to the cockpit, and the flight engineer began explaining to her, the lead flight attendant, that they would need to be prepared for a probable ditching. The lead flight attendant got a lump in her throat, and her heart just jumped. Her blood began to flow faster in her veins, and her nerves stretched. Much like the pilots earlier, there was no time to budget for fear within them. It was time to do what she and the others had learned during extensive training and in ground school that no one would ever believe they needed. She recollected all of her remaining feelings of calmness and came out from the flight deck. She assembled the cabin crew and spoke to them plainly, reminding them of their duties. They were pressed for time, and unaware of how soon they would actually hit the water. Remember, the pilots were so busy with all the work that they were doing to restart that engine, they forgot to give her any more details of how quickly this landing was going to happen other than, quote, imminent. She announced the news to the passengers, and all the passengers must wear their life vests, do not inflate them before they're out of the plane, take the brace positions with the bodies bent forward, head between the knees, and hands above. As it was expected, the fear of the passengers was expressed immediately. The crew's next task was to control and suppress the passengers' fear so that it would not turn into panic, which was something that could be a catastrophic situation on its own right. Falling back on her extensive training, speaking with a cool and collected voice, she explained to the passengers all the processes that were about to happen. More or less, the passengers followed commands, although more than a few responded with panic, which is a normal human response in this scenario. As the head attendant, she began checking for the rest of the crew to get in their right positions while issuing last instructions for the opening of the doors, the life rafts, inflations, and the evacuations. The engines were indifferently silent, a silence so ominous it seems deafeningly loud. The plane continues descending towards the ocean. Now, 10 minutes had elapsed from this moment now since the first oil warning light illuminated. It's a point that I make purposely to convey how little time the crew had in this whole ordeal in order to make decisions and react to what was happening around them. What each account of this incident shares in common is the way the sound around them was absent. Everyone is so used to noise on an airplane of those engines. They're loud and they're almost hard to ignore. And then suddenly they're no longer a plane, but a massive, heavy glider. My grandpa always said that the scariest portion, among many, of this whole ordeal was the sound of, quote, the creepy whistling of the air as they glided, a sound that no one ever wants to hear. That all-familiar sound of the engines operating was replaced by only air and the noise of various systems in the airplane operating off of the APU, the auxiliary power unit, such as the air conditioning or cabin pressure system, for example. Other than that, the passengers on that plane heard nothing more. Now, I cannot imagine how tense and terrifying that must have been, just gliding through the air in silence as a passenger, assuming that the next noise you're going to hear is the sound of the plane slamming against the ocean beneath you. The important part of the story, among so many others, is that the APU is functioning at this point, and without that APU, they wouldn't have a prayer of restarting the one engine that hadn't flamed out. It's the only bit of positive news that the crew has to cling to at this point. At this point in the flight, in this incident, the workload in the flight deck is insanely high. The cockpit became narrow for all three of the men in there. Each of the pilots found difficulty keeping their minds sharp and clear. The fatigue of such overt stress levels was taking its toll on the men while they attempted to focus on their next steps. They needed to dump fuel, communicate with the passengers, the flight attendants, the air traffic controller, and if that wasn't enough, they also needed to prepare for ditching into that blue ocean that was just beneath them. For them and everyone involved in this story, the worst-case scenario imaginable had become the most probable. The voice of the Miami Center air traffic controller broke the silence in the cockpit, saying, "Eastern 855, keep me advised of your intentions. We'll keep you on here as long as we can. Approach is also watching you at the same time. You are about 20 miles west of Bimini right now, and 49 miles southeast of Miami. 12 minutes out at your speed." 12 minutes doesn't seem like that long of a time, but remember, they had no engines. The controller receives an answer drenched with a reluctant pessimism. They will attempt to ditch the aircraft along the coast. Quote, "We do not believe we can make land. Give us directions to the closest land point, please." Although the controller is miles from the aircraft, he is living alongside of them, sharing in that agony of survival, and he replies, "Okay, 855, just as straight in is about the best you can do right now the way it looks here." Now remember that as all of this was going on, the plane is gliding. It's decelerating towards the ocean at an insanely fast rate. To put into perspective how fast, with one engine running, they could keep the rate of descent to about as low as 600 feet per minute. With no engines operating at all, which was what they were currently experiencing, their rate of descent was 1,600 feet per minute. Now, when that third engine failed, they were at an altitude of 12,000 feet. It means unless they could restart one engine that hadn't flamed out entirely, which there's just one left, they would hit the surface of the ocean in just 7.5 minutes. That's a terrifyingly low amount of time to be able to accomplish what they were wanting to do. Captain Thompson recalls in his memoir, quote, "It is here that a clear mind is needed. Number 2 engine did not flame out. We intentionally shut it down, so the probability to restart successfully is not unlikely. We frantically began many attempts at restarting number 2 engine. We used the in-flight restart checklist, but could not get the engine started. I remember yelling at the flight engineer to follow the checklist exactly as it was written," he recalled, and he continues, "And when you got to the item on the checklist, the isolation valve, the response was as required, and fortunately we did not open it. As we descended through 4,000 feet, we were awaiting water impact. One of us suggested we try to start the number 2 engine just one more time. This time we did not use the checklist and went through our normal ground start procedure, including opening the isolation valve. I pressed the engine start switch, saw the green light come on, and the engine RPM rise. What a feeling. At 3,000 feet, we had sufficient power to maintain level flight, and we even climbed back to 4,000 feet. We did not know how long this engine would produce power, and we were still 34 miles from the airport. We chose runway 27L, so we always had the option of either Biscayne Bay or Miami International Airport." The silence of pins and needles was broken when Captain Thompson radioed in the first piece of good news yet. "Miami Center, we have an engine now, and we believe that we can make the airport now." Now, because the crew was well aware of the cause for the engine failure of those other 2, they knew that this one remaining engine, it just wouldn't last for long. Now, fortunately, that one engine was intentionally shut down earlier. If they had left it running, and it would be flamed out, they would not even have a chance of restarting it. They wouldn't have even thought about that. It's well known in the aviation business that professionals in the aviation fly until the last piece of their plane stops working, and that's what they're doing now. They don't care when it will stop. For the time being, it works, and it keeps pushing them towards their salvation. The way to Miami is now around 20 miles. They're wondering if it will keep working, but now they're close to Biscayne Bay, and they have alternative solutions, and the controller from the ground is giving instructions. Eastern 855, tune in. Approach frequency 1181. Okay, turning in 1181, they replied. The heavy planes slipped under the clouds, and they are approaching the well-known narrow strip of land that is Miami. In this case, it looked like the promised land. The descent and the approach continue, and the lights of the runway are visible and twinkling. This was a point in the story that my grandpa always, if you knew him, you'd get a chuckle out of this, but he always said that he was most worried at this point, not that that engine was going to fail because you just didn't have time to think about it, but he was wondering if it was enough to get them over the buildings on the Miami Beach Strip. Now, they're not humongous skyscrapers, but they were so low that he did not know if they were clearing these buildings or not. And he always says that there were 2 things he always remembered feeling from that flight, and he said he could feel how wet his butt was because of how close they were to the water in the first place, and then as they passed over those buildings on Miami Beach, he said they were so close they gave him a strawberry on his butt. I mean, it's just incredible that they made it. The flaps were at the landing settings, the landing gear went down, and the 3 green lights for the landing gear went on. The descent was stabilized. That one engine was operating. It was operating well for the time being. The one engine from the left wing was still trailing a long trail of smoke, like I said earlier, just kind of marking their path towards doom and then eventually salvation. And right when they're just a couple hundred feet above the ground, they radio in one last time. "Miami Center, Eastern 855, we are in about pretty good shape for that. Well, we believe we've got it made." "Okay, sir, we thank you for your help," Captain Thompson said. The passengers in the cabin at this point are still in the brace position, and some of them never even realize how close they were to eternity and how close they are now to salvation. Others from time to time were throwing glances outside the window, waiting to feel the shake of that contact on the runway. Cabin crew members are having the same kind of feeling. Everyone's nerves are stretched. And then suddenly, a shake and some smoke from the tires touching the asphalt surface of the runway. A short jump and a second shake. The plane rolled onto safety of the runway surface. No other landing for this crew was better than that one. In the cabin, the passengers cannot hide their feelings. They burst out in claps and embrace each other and the crew. The flight deck, things are different. There's just silence and relief. but they hadn't finished their job yet. They had to evacuate the runway. As they turned to the first exit available towards the taxiway, as soon as the aircraft stopped, the fire engines shot gallons of foam onto the left wing engine, releasing thick plumes of smoke. They would dump more than 600 gallons on that engine alone until it would cease to push out any more smoke. As they were safely on the ground, my grandpa always said that he could hardly say anything more than, quote, "Sir, thank you for the help," to the air traffic controller who guided them in. He really couldn't muster anything else to say in that moment. But, I mean, obviously he was in shock from the nightmare he just lived through. But, I mean, it's hard to gather the words in that moment when you're sitting there after that realization that you're finally safe and you made it. The ground handling agent said they needed about 15 minutes in order for the vehicle to come and tow them to the gateway, to the stand. The crew decided that with the one remaining engine, they could taxi themselves to the gate, and truly they just wanted to get the passengers off of that plane. That the plane that moments ago seemed more like their coffin. Just as soon as possible, they wanted them off. Now, as my grandpa, Captain Thompson, pushed the throttle up slightly on the engine just to begin taxiing towards the gate and off the runway, the engine sputtered and died. Had that happened just 5 to 10 minutes earlier, the plane would have been on the approach, lost all engines, and it would have crashed to the ground, unable to do anything else at all, at that landing altitude especially. Now, the luck involved with that last engine getting them to safe ground is obviously just unspeakably significant, but the crew of that flight was able to restart that engine while falling from the sky at 1,600 feet per second. Skill started the engine. Luck made it last long enough. In the meantime, the tow tug arrived and it began to tow them to the gateway. Captain Thompson took the microphone and he selected the public address option and spoke to the passengers with a quivering and slightly unstable voice, as he remembers. And he just remembered, even in getting off the plane, getting interviewed, I think, by the New York Times, he said he just remembers shaking and he could hardly speak. In his short announcement, he thanked them for their understanding. The towing finished, and the ground staff positioned the steps at the door of the aircraft, and the passengers began to disembark. Many of them still wore their life vests. They didn't want to undo them, and a lot of them wanted as a souvenir of the adventure that they had just experienced. When the last passenger stepped out of the aircraft, the crew mission in the flight deck and in the cabin was over. Now it was time for one of the many wanted answers to the question, what, how, and why. So one by one, the 3 cockpit crew members stood up from their seats, which was the first time they had stood up, and all 3 of them remembered that all they could feel were shaking knees and how heavy their legs were, as they just tried to walk. Captain Thompson's hands, he describes them as shaking and heavy. And it was at that time that they had fully realized what had happened to them and how they overcame beyond insurmountable odds to do what they had done. And one way or the other, they had done a brilliant job. They got off the plane and met at the gate, and the company's assistant chief pilot and the foreman from the line maintenance met them. The foreman made the statement to them that he knew exactly what had happened. They were slightly astonished by that, and that was the first time that the term O-rings had ever been used. And Captain Thompson remembers, quote, "We were led straight to a convened NTSB hearing." Now, this was the 19th such incident in which master chip detectors, which is a part that detects particles in the oil in each engine, that they had led to a failure for similar incidents. Now, this was the first one with total engine failure, and the first one that came so close to this disaster. But other incidents with this aircraft, not the aircraft so much as, well, I believe it was the aircraft. There were 19 other incidences that were related to the master chip detector. And basically what that does is when oil is in an engine, it circulates and it picks up particles, and it needs to be changed every now and then. Now, if there's big particles, they need to detect that quickly and get it changed out. So that's what this chip detector does. Because you're taking it out and in, it needs an O-ring to make sure it seals that gap so that no oil can seep out. When these chip detectors were replaced, the O-rings weren't on it. And that's the reason that the oil seeped out and none of them had any oil left. So the fault was not really just on the mechanics alone. The chip detectors were in sealed bags that were labeled, quote, usable parts, which meant that they had been inspected, they were ready to go, open the bag, plug and play. Now, the reason I said earlier that this kind of revolutionized the way that aircraft travel is today is because it was finally an incident that was drastic enough that the FAA made a standard work procedure. The crew that replaced these master chip detectors, they worked in the middle of the night. After this incident, the FAA made a requirement that no overnight labor should be done between 4 and 6 a.m., which are like the hardest hours to work and the hardest hours for some people, or pretty much everyone's brains, to function correctly. They also had a standardized work procedure. The two mechanics that were working on it, they could not actually see the master chip detectors as they were replacing them. One of them used the tug that he was driving, the lights, just to light up the engine, but you still couldn't get all the way in there and see. They both said that they did it by feel. Now, one big deal of this was accountability. And in the world of today, with mechanics especially on a commercial flight, the amount of accountability is absurd, and as well as it should be, because that's, the lives of hundreds of people. Hundreds and thousands of people fly every day, millions probably. So you can't just be cavalier with those lives. After this, they made a rule that you can't have two mechanics sign the work order of the other on the same plane. So basically what happened was, because it was so early in the morning, I think it was like 4:30 in the morning when they were replacing these, they just signed each other's work cards. And it wasn't malicious, it was just they didn't expect it, because replacing that was as easy as replacing wiper blades on a car. I mean, it was just a no-brainer for them. It just so happened that the O-rings that were supposed to be on there in that bag that said these parts are good to go weren't included. And both of them admitted in the hearings later that they don't think they've ever checked to make sure the O-rings were on it. It's just always there. They said since they were working by feel, they couldn't tell the difference of the way one felt with or without O-rings. So to say that it's the fault of just the mechanics or the airline or the FAA, it's not. It's kind of a joined effort. Now, Eastern Airlines isn't in business anymore, but it changed the way it did its mechanics. The FAA changed the way it mandated its mechanics, and everything got safer. So because of this one incident where, I mean, by all accounts, they should have died. They should have just plummeted into the ocean. And my grandpa always said, like, we were preparing for ditching, but he always had in the back of his mind, we were preparing to just try not to die, because the odds of that water landing were next to impossible, especially on the ocean, which wasn't smooth like a river. They just didn't, he always said he didn't really think it would be able to be done. But against all odds, they restarted that engine, and today we live in a safer travel world because of this one incident. 6 days after this incident, my grandfather and Captain Dick, they flew again together. Captain Dick was still needing his formal 25 hours of flight in his logbook to be assigned to the captain's duties in the L-1011, which is just kind of comical to think about. In fact, however, he had passed his examinations on board Eastern Airlines Flight A55 with an A+. It was going to be the toughest examination he would ever receive in his life. I just wanted to add a quick thank you to all of listeners out there, and a quick reminder that you can subscribe to the show on iTunes, leave us a review. It helps us just to be discovered and to keep this show going better. You can go to the website, themondayamerican.com. You can get a t-shirt there. It is $17.76, because that's what an American t-shirt costs. You can follow us on Twitter, Facebook. We do some stuff on Instagram. You can tell us how much you love us or hate us, or both, at contact@themondayamerican.com. You can shoot us an email right there. That's contact@themondayamerican.com. Let us know what you thought about this story. If you don't like the kind of odd one small incident story and would rather just focus on the broad history stuff with American history, let us know. We'll do that. We'll tell you that you suck and you're wrong for disagreeing with us, but that's just what you should expect from the highly sarcastic me. Thank you again for everyone who was listening. This story was just a very important one to me, as it was, like I said, throughout my grandfather's story. And like I said, he's my hero. He was my hero growing up. And since he passed away this year, I thought it was very fitting to just honor his memory with this story. And I wanted to make sure it was heard by everyone, and that him and everyone involved with this, all the pilots and all the crew, everyone in the ATC, air traffic control, they all got the credit that was due for avoiding the death of all 172 people aboard that airplane. So thank you again for listening, and stay tuned for more. We're working on a lot of stuff, and we will see you soon. Bye.